mean, I'm not an expert on FDI, but I must say that I learned quite a bit, and many confusions that I had about what FDI is, and at least some of them got clarified during this presentation. It doesn't seem to me to be very surprising that M&A data shows up as being very significant for India, because as a political economist, I find that India is not a very good source of, not a very good host of greenfield investments, because India has a capitalist class which is quite entrenched, and there is a political economy, infrastructure, regulatory issues, and oftentimes it seems that FDI gets into India because they're able to partner with somebody, and I think that's showing up in your, there's a little bit of, so for example, Airtel becomes India's leading telecom service provider after getting substantial injections from Singtel and Warburg Pincus, which has very significant effects. Perhaps somebody who's in the business school should do this kind of work, to the extent that, you know, cash-rich companies like Tata and Reliance are still unable to beat Airtel at its game, despite many regulatory ups and downs. So from that perspective, one can be a little bit more nuanced about what is the impact of, because, but then I think the point is well taken that one has to be. So I think with those few comments, I'm sure there are lots of questions. Yeah. Yes, Sujin.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think it's very important discussion to specify the methodology to calculate or measure the FDI flows. But I'm still confused with your conceptualizing greenfield type of FDI and M&A. And as far as I know, as a political scientist, I'm not an economist, and greenfield type of investment is not something, you know, comparable with M&A, right? Greenfield investment is free from the concept of ownership, while M&A is substantially considered of ownership problem, which could be comparable with the other types of investment, like wholly owned subsidiaries and joint venture. So I was wondering why you, you know, equate, why you wanted to compare green type of investment with M&A. And if my understanding is wrong, then please correct me. As far as I understand, the greenfield investment could have subset, which includes M&A with the other WOS, wholly owned subsidiaries, and joint venture types of investment, right? And if my logic is right, and do you have any comparable data about wholly owned subsidiaries and also at the same time joint venture? Did you consider those concepts too?
Do you want to take some questions? Sure. So thanks for the question. Just a quick point about the political economy angle is interesting. I was going to say in terms, and I'll get to your question in a minute. So we said in the case of India versus China, for instance, why does India seem to have relatively more M&A? And we said, well, is it a sign of strength in terms of financial market development, or is it a sign of weakness in terms of problems with greenfield, greenfield investment not being attractive in India? There's another dimension also, which is the extent of the entrepreneurial class, right? And so yes, the political economy dimension certainly is important, but also just thinking in terms of some countries like India with very strong entrepreneurial class, they've already developed domestic industries, and so if I want to come and get access into India, it's much easier to come in through the M&A route. So fair enough. With regard to the question about M&A versus greenfield, so in the data, and this is accepted, UNCTAD, IMF, and all countries follow this. You have greenfield, which is actually new. So you have new equity investment, retained earnings, and others. Okay, forget about others, fairly small. We talked about retained earnings, leave that aside. New equity investment, there are two different categories, distinct categories. Greenfield, setting up a new company, and the new company could be in the form of joint venture, right? And or merger and acquisition, right? International business folks will tell you, well, there's a difference between mergers and acquisitions, and within acquisitions, it could be a hostile takeover versus a mutually agreeable, friendly takeover, but leave that aside. But M&A is saying, well, you're right, it's a transfer of ownership, but it's distinct from greenfield. So you could have an M&A also as a form of JV, you could have a greenfield as a form of JV as well, okay, or a wholly owned subsidiary. Okay, but they are two distinct. Okay, and and the point we're trying to emphasize, and this is clearly a limitation both of the data and of economists who work in this and policymakers as well. We want to promote FDI because FDI brings in increases gross capital formation, brings in technology transfer, etc., and then have an open door policy towards all types. Then they say, and they look at whether FDI has gone up or not, and if it's gone up, it's a sign of success. And our point is, no, it may have gone up significantly, but it may just have been mergers and acquisitions, transfer of ownership. And I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. I'm just saying all these benefits really that people talk about is predominantly greenfield. M&A could have benefits, but they're more secondary. But they are distinct.
Thank you for the presentation.
I think it's a good idea to introduce ourselves.
Okay.
That was Sojin Shin. She completed her PhD from South Asian Studies. She's now research associate.
And Dipargo Mukherjee, visiting research fellow currently at ISAS. A thought that I was having was that maybe this is the best that one could do in trying to identify the root source of FDIs, but maybe the approach is slightly limited to sectors which have most FDI through M&A channel. And I would like your comment on how this varies across. So is the source of FDI guided by which sector it is coming into? What is the role of investment agreements in identifying the key source of FDI? Something like that, if you have done anything like that.
You shouldn't be so quiet. You want to say something? Actually, but Sasi works a lot on this data, and he actually pointed out the logic data, which is a really good source. But coming to your point, so again, the focus here was, because we have more macro in orientation, really about the country sources, right? We have started looking at sectors, and there are actually good data available on sectors. Both of us have a lot of interest in the banking sector, and we started to look at that. But there is good data on sectors, and just at least I don't know about the other non-India BRICS, but in the case of India, one of the points when I went to Delhi, one of the issues for DIPP was, well, if you look at those pie charts we had, about 4 to 5% of FDI into India is in pharma, in overall FDI. About 20% is M&A. So if you just isolate the M&A data, it's predominantly pharma. So what we can do, therefore, is, I think what you're alluding to is break it down now by sectors and say which sectors are getting relatively more M&A, which are getting more FDI, but not so much M&A, so therefore presumably it's more retained earnings or greenfield, same thing, versus those that are getting M&A, and we can do something with that. Very few people have done things like that, and that's, again, our, if you will, bottom line. Moving beyond just the FDI data, we can actually start playing around with some of this stuff about the type and quality of FDI, as it were.
Thank you. And Amitendu from ISAS, and Kishan and Sasi, as usual, congratulations. I mean, this is not only very rigorous, I think you touch upon subjects which many people avoid for obvious reasons, that there's not enough data, there's not enough, I would say, credibility in supporting what you eventually conclude. Now, I have a few queries comments for you. The first is, Kishan, since you have been on this for a very long time, and I must admit that FDI was one of my primary interests, but I have moved away from it somewhat. I was just wondering that when we define FDI internationally and we look at the definition, this 10% threshold, which goes back to the 1992 IMF Balance of Payments Manual. Has there been any debate subsequently or any discussion as to whether this threshold level needs to be revised? The reason why I raise this is because you very correctly mentioned that if it's 9.9%, it's portfolio, if it's 10.1%, it's FDI. So intuitively, one gets drawn to the fact that if you're actually conceptually working on a different threshold, you might stand to, widen the space between what can technically qualify as greenfield and what cannot. And that would have a huge impact on the nature of the statistics that we have today. So if there's any debate going on in that regard, and if you'd kindly enlighten on that. Sasi, one of the issues that I had on that, on the moving averages that you presented in the BRICS 2001 to 2002, I distinctly remember that for a very long time, China did not follow the OECD definition or the IMF definition in reporting FDI. And I think this probably went on till 2005 or 2006. Now, to an extent, UNCTAD is handicapped by the fact that it has to take data from the national source agencies. Now, when you compare the BRICS and you look at China specifically, I'm just wondering whether the statistics that we get to see from China are actually comparable to the structures in which India and Brazil report them. Because India, remember, we did an enormous amount of work to align this to the SDDS standards. And China, if I'm not mistaken, I think China still doesn't subscribe to the SDDS. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, it could be just an issue. So just to, give you a little bit of awareness on that point. The third point that I had, and this is more of a question, and I sort of come back to the India and Brazil conclusions that you have, which is in terms of M&A having a greater share in FDI, and you throw a couple of issues on this, that this could be due to the difficulties that greenfield faces, which I think is a very well taken point. One of the points that I'm wondering is that if this is a motive for pushing more investors looking at India and Brazil into the OFC or the tax haven route, let's say Mauritius or other, then is there any way of finding out that the transshipped FDI, which is coming in through Mauritius, for example, into India, does the bulk of that FDI also move into the M&A route, or is it more greenfield? The reason why I ask this is that if it does, then the only incentive for that is actually tax arbitrage, and that very firmly establishes your round-tripping logic. You see? So in that case, what that means is that there's no greenfield activity, no capacity creation, no addition to the gross capital formation of the economy, but what you are actually getting to see is just utilization of a segment of the international financial system and the structures that you have for capitalizing on tax arbitrage opportunities. So that's something on which I thought it would be very useful if you have your thoughts. And my last point is that this entire M&A conclusion that you draw here, very useful and very substantive, but I'm just wondering, is it a bit industry specific? Is it a little influenced by the structure of the pharma industry? The reason being that pharma is probably an industry where M&A would certainly be a very attractive option because it allows that much of market access. But would you expect the same to happen in a sector like railways, for example? Or let's say in a sector like education, which are the upcoming FDI sectors. So that could be one way of qualifying the larger entry trend. So sorry to have burdened you with all this, but would be very happy to have your takes.
Thanks, Amitenda, for the questions. Let me take it first and see. So first question about 10% threshold. Again, as you know, it's very ad hoc. There's been some discussion about increasing it to 20%, which is what the US did for a long period of time, and then they reneged and went to 10%. Nothing has moved on that thing. So it's 10. So you're right. I mean, 10% is 20%. Something more than 10%, 20, 30% would help make that distinction, but nothing has happened. Yeah, I don't, but 10% it is, right? But definitions matter, right? My most the commonly used example is, again, going back to the CFIUS in the US. So the China Sovereign Wealth Fund wanted to buy into Blackstone. This was in 2008 or so. And they want to buy an equity stake, which basically was equal to about 11.5% equity stake, and the Blackstone folks themselves said, don't do it, reduce your equity stake by about 9.8, 9.9, because then it doesn't have to go to CFIUS. CFIUS doesn't block everything, but the point is you don't get into that political drama potentially. So by 9.8, 9.9%, which they did, and then slowly later on, a few years later, they ramped it up to 12%, so the additional stake. By right in the BOP statistics, what should happen is the minute it gets ramped up over 10% that year, that full initial 9.9 stake that had come in as portfolio, right, should show up as a portfolio outflow, and the full, say, 10.1 is what they have brought in. The 10.1 should turn as a full FDI inflow. But no one keeps track of BOP data nearly as carefully. So it's really at the margin. So definitions certainly matter, but so 10% is very ad hoc. What else? In terms of the China data, Sasi can talk to that issue, but just a quick point, neither of us, we have looked at the India data very carefully. So now, like we said, the next step is really to look at China, Brazil, and Russia to get a better sense of it. So I don't know, but my sense is that India, as you know, the big problem was really about retained earnings. Okay, I'm not really sure. I don't think it's a 10% threshold. China included retained earnings well before India, right? There was a big IFC paper a number of years ago saying, well, if you compare China and India in the 1990s, in some senses, India's FDI is significantly understated because they don't include retained earnings like China and others do. But the 10% threshold, not so sure. I wouldn't worry about the other component, which is other capital and debt, because that's fairly small, marginal. I have to think through, honestly, the point about round tripping a bit more. I'll talk to you a bit more about that. We have to, I mean, look, the way the John Wally paper, the China paper, estimated a number of years ago in 2004, about 30% is round tripping. I have to go back to how they did that guesstimate. The John Wally paper in Canada has got some traction, but it's not all that interesting, quite honestly, because the way they define round tripping is very simply, there's a high correlation between inward FDI and outward FDI, right? And so let's say outward FDI from, let's use India rather than Russia as an example. Outward FDI from India into Mauritius is $50. Inward FDI is $70. Therefore, the actual FDI flows from Mauritius or transshipped via Mauritius is actually $20. The $50 is really round tripping, and that's very basic. You have your ways sounds more nuanced, but when you think about it, your last point about industry specific, you're right. I mean, I've actually, to the credit of the DIPP and the RIS where I was there, they actually got me thinking about the sectors, right? I think many of us macro folks don't think enough about sectors and sectoral differences, et cetera, and there are key differences. So is it influenced by pharma? Yes, insofar as I don't know other sectors all that well. But I think the more general point, I like to draw a parallel between banking and pharma, and I think the big difference again is the regulatory structure. If both of them are important from a development perspective, again, it's not a matter of therefore don't have FDI. Yes, have FDI, but how does it help meet your development objectives? In the case of banking, we are much more careful in terms of ensuring financial inclusion issues, etc. Pharma, we don't have those types of things. Education, yes, open up to FDI, but again, there's enough domestic regulations in education, like in banking, that I'm more comfortable with it, as it were. And so that, but you're right, it's definitely, I don't know enough about the sectors.
No, I mean, just a couple of quick points, because China I haven't really looked at very carefully about the compatibility issues as such, because it didn't really come up in any of the searches. I mean, but you've been working on China for a while. I'll go back and definitely I'll look at to see whether it's different. But one point of the sectors that I wanted to mention, going back to tying it to your question as well, was if you, I'm just staring at the charts that we presented in here. There seems to be a broad correlation between the sectors that you talk about in both FDI and M&A for the same time period. Actually, if you look at inbound M&As and FDI inflows broadly, but the biggest problem we faced was lumping categories into different names. So it's very hard to decipher what they are. I mean, for instance, say services 20%. What services? Services can be anything under the sun, right? I don't know what services is. I mean, and you have top 10 sectors don't change much in India's DIBP format. If you go to DIBP, the top 10, very minor changes. But Daylogic gives you breakdown, really goes down to the T, and so it's much harder to compare the two. And so the keywords like telecom, you can pick up and say, oh, there's telecom here, there's telecom here. So you do see some broad representation that way, fine. But beyond that, the names, I mean, the way they've classified the sectors seems a little problematic. But I guess you have data on M&A side, and if we have more data on the FDI side, I mean, in terms of, apart from this, the top 10 that we see from DRPP, with a better breakdown in terms of exactly what is it that they have, then probably we'll be able to answer that, reconcile that too, and see if the flows that go into FDI and not into M&A, or want M&A and not into FDI. But that's all that I wanted to add. But yeah, but China data, I mean, I'll look at it, and definitely I'll look at it, look into it. Yeah, thank you. They call it something, China Statistic Layer Book or something? No, yeah, that's what they call it. Because yeah, you cannot. Oh, or maybe a Xiaomi phone. But UNCTAD just compiles this information from all these country sources. So their source for India is RBI. The source for China is.
Time when China used to include ECBs into the intra-corporate debt, which is remarkable. Come across that.
Any other questions? We don't have any other questions. I think very important questions have been raised, and I think you have thrown light on very important questions. And I was just thinking, I was thinking aloud from a macro perspective, because I don't understand the nuances of many of the things that you've researched on. Round tripping is a problem, right? Right now you are only focused on regulatory issues of M&As, and I think that's very important. But if you concede that round tripping is equally a problem, and even more of a problem than the strategic nature of M&As and how they should be regulated, then I think a very interesting pattern is emerging out of your paper, which is that M&A is a good way to, in some senses, measure non-tax haven sources of FDI. That it really struck me as being something very, very interesting. And while I was very struck and excited by this, I also found that in the case of China, you have this predicament, right, which is Hong Kong, which which gives you both M&A and which gives you round tripping. So I'm just thinking that I think one major insight of your presentation is that there is at least one way to think about how to exclude tax havens from, I don't know whether it can be another paper or not, but although the China picture, for all the other BRICS countries, you are actually able to, almost do a controlled experiment, right? But China is confusing because we don't know what's happening there. So I don't know whether you want to work on that a little bit and tell us something about the nature of round tripping and the real farce that FDI figures are. And maybe you will make progress beyond John Wally. But this is just like a fancy thought I had, listening to, I think, a remarkably incisive research presentation. So with that, I think I can, unless you want to comment on it, but you don't need to comment on it because it's just a fancy thought I had. And
actually, that's one of the, in terms of future research, that's one of the things to try and get a sense of.
Yeah, I think that's very significant, and with respect to M&A, you can have actually a more nuanced approach, because what happens in India is that The political economy there is a political economy of two types of corporations. There are the really cash-rich corporations who are multinationals in their own right and who don't need any foreign investment. And they are pitted with corporations who are there are some corporations in different sectors who are very enterprising, who are very aggressive, and they actually build competition into the sector. And the only way they can survive against the cash-rich guys is by drawing into foreign talent, expertise, and finance. And I think if somebody did a good corporate history of Airtel, this would come out. I've only looked at the regulatory side of it. But the regulatory side tells me that this is probably what will come out, because how the hell, of course they were very aggressive and they also did very strong lobbying and all of that. But that's a constant, it's not a variable. It's not like Reliance doesn't do lobbying. It's not that the Tatas don't do lobbying. So when you think about M&As, maybe you can be which you already think you should be. So I think there are great insights, and I personally learned a great deal. I think we are really privileged that you thought about us and decided to visit us and present. And let's hope that there will be occasion to engage with your research. Yeah.
A quick point, we just forgot, just as it came to me as we were talking about the round tripping. I think one aspect of the research was also on outward FDI.
Yes.
And so we were trying to, reconcile inward FDI flows and inbound acquisitions. Now, the same mirror image can be done for outward FDI flows, which is also emerging as a very important phenomenon in all these countries, especially China. OFDI is a very important pattern. And look at outbound acquisitions as India, countries purchases elsewhere, outside, and then see if that could lead us to figure out some answers for round tripping as such.
Absolutely, I think that would be. So thank you very much, and I think we can now continue our discussions over tea. But before we end this session, I think ISAS is always generous to with. Thank you very much. Great.